Welcome to Filmmaker U Live. I'm Gordon Burkell, and every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we go live with a film professional to discuss their techniques and ideas. This week, I'm joined with Anne McCabe, editor of Succession, Nurse Jackie, and the recent film, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Anne, welcome to the show.
Hi, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Well, I guess, you and I were just chatting before we went live, and we almost missed our cue there from Jason. So you mentioned something that sort of popped out, stuck in my ear there, and that's you said that how you like to approach a scene has changed over the years. So I'm wondering how you used to approach scenes as an editor and how you do now. Like, what was the change that occurred?
Well, I think when you're starting, you have less confidence, and obviously I watch everything, but when I was starting, I would watch everything. I would read the script, and I would look at all the script notes very carefully, and look at all the notes, what the director would say and what their idea was for the scene. And now what I do is I watch everything. I pull out pieces that I think are interesting and cool. But I don't even actually look at the script again before I watch the scene. And I don't look at the script notes so much. And I will try to treat the scene in a way as if I'm a viewer looking at this for the first time. And did any of this footage, resonate with me or make me laugh or move me in any way? So it's almost like there's this process of writing the script, and then there's a process of shooting it on the set, and then there's a process of you viewing it. So I kind of try to put myself in the shoes of a viewer, put the scene together, and then I do actually eventually go back and look at what the notes were and confer with the director for sure and see if there was some idea they had. But it's interesting to have that first pass of the scene where you come up with something that maybe that they hadn't thought of, but because you're a fresh eye looking at the footage, you're somebody who's seen it as if you're watching it for the first time.
Well, what's interesting about that, I guess my worry would be as a young editor would be trying to make sure that you're pleasing the director in the sense of you're going to get these notes, the circle takes and the specifics. So how do you make sure that when you're doing this approach that you still are respecting the editor or the director's desires?
Oh, of course. Yeah. So I definitely look at it all afterwards. Mm-hmm. I might make a version of the scene just how I'm thinking it might go, or might be an interesting way to go. And usually my first pass is very, very rough and not that great, but it's just this is kind of a cool way to go about it. But then I go look at this. Certainly before I hand in the assembly, I look line for line to make sure I have every single line. And I think about the intent of the script, and I look at all the notes that the director has sent. And sometimes they've sent me an email, or they'll call me and they'll say, can you make sure you use this shot at the end? This is the kind of thing we were planning. So I don't ignore it, but it's almost like the very first time I watch it. Sometimes you might come up with an interesting idea. I also will have alts, I'll do a version of the scene, and then I'll, have another alt in my pocket to kind of show oh, here's another way to go that you might want to go. The other thing that I do is and I think a lot of young editors try to make the scene sort of perfect when they first cut it, and it's often very, very tight. And they sort of keep to the rhythms of exactly how it was. Say there's two cameras going, they'll cut the checkerboard between the two cameras, and they won't change the timing at all. They'll keep it, and it often is kind of too quick. Mm-hmm. And I think that I often my first pass at stuff is very loose. It's just well, this is a really cool shot, and this is a really cool beat, and it's too long. And then when I have the whole thing, the whole movie or the whole show, I'll then watch it again, and it's very clear where places that it's too long or you need to tighten it up. But it's better to kind of have things too long and you start to kind of milk moments and milk beats, and then you tighten it up okay, this is getting boring, we need to tighten it up. But it's better to have it too long than to have it this sort of rushed moment, you didn't actually see somebody's transition on their face. You didn't sort of see somebody come to a decision, or you didn't kind of milk this beat for humor. So I kind of like sometimes make this very big, messy version of the movie. And sometimes there's even like repeated lines and things. And then I'll go through and be like, okay, now it's really clear this one over that one. I'm going to tighten it up here. There's one example actually I can't remember what episode it is, but we were talking about Nurse Jackie.
Yeah.
Who was the director? I'm trying to remember. He directed Heathers. He's a really smart guy. Anyway, he had shot the scene. There was a scene between Nurse Jackie, and she's talking to this like real jerk of a guy. And they're arguing. And then somebody in the other side of the room does something. And the director had shot it with this person sort of like very much out of focus way in the background. And then I ended up using this shot because I just thought it was kind of cool. And it wasn't his intention at all to use the shot, but he liked it. And I'm not saying like every idea I do is good, because a lot of times they don't like my ideas, but like this one he particularly was like, oh, that was cool. I never would have thought of using that. Like it was actually shot for a different setup, but you sort of saw this guy in the background, and that's how you introduced this character. So sometimes you'll come up with something that's sort of interesting and fun.
How do you make sure not to become precious about your stuff? Because one of the things in editing that's something that I find a lot of young editors need to learn is that the first cut is just the first cut. Like you're going to have so many cuts after that. And, the director's going to give their opinion, the producer's, the broadcaster, or the studio, or, and then you're going to play it for a group of people and get feedback. And how do you make sure you as an editor don't become sort of locked on to a particular approach that you have?
Yeah, that is key. I mean, you need to not kind of have this incredibly huge ego, because it's a collaborative process, and there's writers and there's actors and directors and producers and tons of feedback on movies. Particularly, you're going to have all these screenings where people rip it to shreds, and they talk about how much they hate it and why this part was really boring and this part didn't make them laugh. So you need to kind of check your ego at the door. And I know like a lot of young editors, and particularly when I was young too, is like somebody would criticize something and you'd feel really defensive, and you'd feel like you'd need to say, well, that was because there wasn't another shot, or, some reason. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear about like, they didn't get this on the day, or they didn't have that. It's just like, you need to kind of just take a deep breath and go like, okay, well, how can we make this better? Or what about this? And, and occasionally it comes back to some idea that you already had. But I know a lot of people, they like to tell stories about how, well, that was what I originally did, and we went back to my original cut. But I don't actually think that that's the point. The point is to make something really good, and you're working with other people, you're bouncing ideas off of other people. Mm-hmm. And the audience, they can be really obnoxious and hate it, or they can love it, but it's like important to realize you're actually playing it for other people, and it's good information.
Now we actually have a question from the audience viewing this.
Okay.
Chris wants to know when a cutting session, when you're cutting Succession, is there a lot of improv? If so, how do you cut something like that and still maintain the story that was written? It's a good question.
That is a good question. Yeah, Succession is super fun to cut. Very, very, very difficult to cut, but so fun because it almost like breaks a million rules. In particular, the way that it's shot is that it's shot from all over the place, and the camera's constantly moving, and you don't stick to kind of rules about eye lines and who you need to be on for certain things. The whole thing is sort of the rhythm of the language and the jokes and the drama. Like that's what I kind of keep in my head when I'm cutting Succession. There is improv. There's lots of suggestions on set because, the writer, Jesse Armstrong, who's like so funny and brilliant, he's on set all the time. So sometimes they're coming up with stuff. Certainly Roman is often coming up with, and Matthew, they are both coming up with like, who plays the brother-in-law. Yeah. They often come up with funny lines and cousin Greg, like there's a lot of people who come from comedy or know how to do comedy. So they do come up with improv. The thing about Succession too, is that they're written very long, very dense and very long. And the first cut of a show is maybe like an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
Almost 2 hours sometimes. So you are just whittling it down to like there's whole pieces that get removed and, you know, dialogue that gets removed and scenes that get removed. And it's like becomes very, very tight. And it's not like, oh, this isn't good. It's like, how can we serve the story in the best possible way? Like the writing is just really strong. And then you have all these great actors. But another interesting thing about Succession is that he comes from comedy, Jesse Armstrong. And, you know, he did this show, Peep Show, which is really hilarious. And he wanted to hire editors who had done comedy. Even though the show is a drama and it's an hour long, it, you know, like it really veers between the two genres, goes back and forth, which is super fun. Like that's really fun to do both, you know?
Well, what makes it so fun, that shifting between comedy and drama? What do you like about that?
I love cutting comedy. It is really fun, but it's really mostly fun to cut something that's like really smart comedy. But, you know, like it's an incredible challenge to get to do both, to make something like to kind of work with the comedy and to the timing of all that. And then you're quickly shifting into something else, which is the drama, which is another enormous challenge. To sort of do both is, it's kind of ideal. And also personally, I like watching things, even a drama that has some humor to it. You know, like things that are completely without humor they're kind of tough to watch. I mean, I find it. I like having some comic relief, you know?
You know what? I've been driving my wife nuts because she'll be like, oh, I want to watch this drama or that drama. And I'm like, I just can't. For the last like 7 years, I'm like, just comedies.
Yes. Well, it's been kind of a rough bunch of years, so everybody loves to watch it. Schitt's Creek is like number one. Everybody loves Schitt's Creek. It's really funny. But yeah, no, you know, my husband's the same way. You know, he likes to watch all the action adventures. And we've been watching this really cool show, Le Bureau, you know, the French show.
Sounds familiar.
It's like a spy thriller. It's really good. There's actually not that much comedy, a little bit, but it's really good.
Now we have a question from Harry, but before we get into questions about a beautiful day in the neighborhood, because that's what his question's about, I do have one other question about Succession.
Oh, okay, sure.
And that is, before we came on air, you said you really liked cutting it because it was a different way of cutting. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting because we're going to talk about Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, and then we're talking about Succession, and they are completely different ways of cutting. Like Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is a very measured, slow building drama. It has its moments of humor, and it's very moving, and it's incredibly hard way of cutting, and it's the way that it's shot is more formal. You know, you're not like shifting eye lines going all over the place. With Succession, it's like all rules get pretty much thrown out the window, but you're just listening to your ear for the comedy, for the drama, and then of course like the beautiful, you know, cinematography and everything too. But it's just like, how can we make this make sense with these cameras that are just going everywhere? They have like so many cameras going and so many characters. I mean, something like Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, it's a lot between two people talking, one or two, maybe three people talking. And then in Succession, there's all these different characters and these big group, like a big group board meeting, and how do you keep everybody alive in the room and the tension of it all. It's a very tense show.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like Beautiful Day has some tension too, but it's a different kind.
Yeah.
It's a slow build. It's a measured. It's also like you're trying to make people cry. Like that was, you felt very like successful. Like, I mean, not that I want people to be sad, but like a kind of very cathartic, you know, way of moving people. And it felt good in a screening when you saw that people were crying like 3-4 times during the movie.
You're like, I did it.
And then in other movies, it's like, oh, you can't, you know, when the audience erupts with laughter, that's where you feel really good. You know, like, oh yeah, not only me, but we contributed to making people, you know. So
to get to Harry's question, he asked, when you're working on A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, did you study the editing of the Mr. Rogers TV show and try to implement that in any way into your cuts?
Absolutely. We definitely did. We watched so many episodes. And, you know, I watched it as a kid, and then Mari, who's a director, watched it and watched it. She also watched it as a kid. The DP did, the production designer did, the actors did. There's a little sequence in Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood when they actually kind of go into this, like, how do you make this? You know, like, how do you make paper, or, you know, whatever it is. And that little sequence was shot very much in mind of the little sequences in Mr. Rogers where, you know, like they'd have these little things about how crayons are made, or, you know, so we studied it, and we thought about the music that was often played in those things. And then with the show part of it, you know, where he's talking to the audience, you know, there's not very many cameras. It's like 2 cameras, and it's a little clunky sometimes. So some of the edits in there are like deliberately a tiny bit clunky, not terribly clunky. It wasn't like they were terrible at it, but you know, it's live. You know, they're cutting live. So sometimes there's a little delay. So we definitely tried to kind of mirror that. And then overall in the movie, it's like Mr. Rogers is a very calm, measured person. It's not like a quick cutting, you know.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the things that I was really impressed with Tom Hanks is he got, and for lack of a better term, was like Mr. Rogers pacing, because there was never anything, I don't want to say fast about Mr. Rogers, because he was a very smart man, but it was very methodical. Like everything was almost thought out in his movements and everything. And so that's what I really appreciated in terms of Tom Hanks's performance.
Yeah, he did an incredible performance. And he also like was able to sort of convey the complexity of the man. He was not just like a simple man, you know, he had anger, he had a huge range of emotions, and things were he took things on, and things were very difficult for him. So you could see that layer in Tom Hanks's eyes, you know.
So how did you, you know, work with the director to find a balance between the original book and article that this was based on, but also sort of give us more of a balanced perspective of Mr. Rogers? Because if I remember the original article, it was how, you know, meeting Mr. Rogers impacted the writer. But in this movie, that's still the focus of the movie, but we have more of Mr. Rogers, I guess you could say, involved. So how did you work with the director to find that balance?
Well, it was definitely like a much more fleshed out script. The script was a lot more elaborate. And of course, our first cut of the movie was way longer. It always is, you know. It was, you know, 2 hours something, 2.5 hours long, our first cut of the movie. And so there was a lot of honing what was interesting, what was dynamic, what was moving. It always seems to come down to, like, in the beginning, the relationship between Mr. Rogers and Matthew Rhys, you know, Tom Hanks and Matthew Rhys, was the kind of such the crux of the movie that you felt like that needed to come earlier in the movie. So we had removed like some scenes that happened at the beginning, that like it was sort of longer before we met, that the two of them got to meet. So we pushed that up. That was one of the things. We lost a bunch of scenes in the beginning to kind of create that shape. And I think, and also it's just like people in the audiences, they really loved seeing Tom Hanks, Mr. Rogers. So you got to have a lot of that, you know?
That was going to be my question, was there feedback of like, we want more Rogers?
Yeah, we were like trying to find anything that we could of him, you know, because yes, absolutely. He was very popular. I mean, Tom Hanks is a very popular actor. Mr. Rogers not for everybody, of course, but a lot of people really love Mr. Rogers. So it was like more of that was what we needed.
Now, did you guys show it to his wife? Because I feel like she was an important part of his life, and you'd almost want to make sure that she's happy with it too. Were you able to get feedback from her?
They were, his wife and then people that had worked with him in Pittsburgh were part of the process. They were part of the process of reading the script. They came to set. They're actually extras in a scene, in the scene in the restaurant where he kind of turns and looks at the camera, and he, you know, he sort of everybody kind of takes a pause of silence, 1 minute of silence. she's in that scene, and as were the real Mr. McFeely, the real director of the show, a bunch of people who had worked with the real Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, were there. So like they were very much a part of the whole process, and Mari just thought it was incredibly important to kind of have their blessing and not do anything that they felt uncomfortable with, because they're all very protective of him, of course.
Of course, yeah. Now, you said before we came on that one of the things you love about editing was the process that you go through with directors and getting on the same wavelength with directors. I was wondering if you could take us through that, what your process is with directors.
Well, you know, it's different with every single person, and there's different movies and television shows have different sorts of challenges, but there's a whole process of creating the assembly, which is almost always the most difficult part, because it just, you're watching endless takes of things and trying to shape it and put it together, and you're like, what am I going to do here? And you have lots of self-doubt. And then the director comes in, and almost always they're like really appalled by what you've done. They're like, what is this? You know, but sometimes they like some of it. But it almost always they say, oh, we have a lot of work to do, which you should never feel disheartened by, because of course you do. You know, it's too long, it's boring, it's not what everybody wants in the end. But yes, you have to kind of feel out what's best for them a lot of the time. I mean, not to kind of completely remove your personality, because they obviously are hiring you for your opinion and your skill, but you have to kind of learn how best to work with that person. And some people just want to like dive in and try a whole bunch of things that they were dying to do and you didn't do. And then some people like want to ask you a million questions of like, well, what do you think? Should we get rid of this or should we get rid of that? And it's usually kind of a balance of the two. But I would say one tip is that as soon as they watch it, their anxiety level goes up through the roof, because they're like, oh my God, what did I do? I didn't need it for it to be like this. And why is it so boring? And especially when they're not as experienced. The more experienced directors tend not to be quite so negative, but you should never take it personally, because they often come around and be like, oh no, this is great, you know, but it's like, it's hard for them to watch.
Did you learn anything from watching all those Mr. Rogers episodes about dealing with people when they were stressed?
Yes, exactly. Oh my God. Everybody, we were talking about how we were like nicer to her, because Mari, like we were nicer to our kids and nicer to our husbands, and we were like more patient and more listening, you know, like you have to listen. I mean, in the cutting room, seriously, you make a good point. You have to listen a lot, you know, like don't jump in with, oh no, that's not why I did it there, or there is no shot, or they want to try things. Sometimes it'll happen that they'll go like, oh, I had this other idea and I really want to do it. Sure, let's try it out. And sometimes you end up using it and you've come up with a cool new thing, or you come back to what you have done, or it's a combination of the two. But you don't want to be like this knee jerk, oh no, we can't do that, we can't try that, because nobody wants that. Like they're not gonna want to be around you if you're gonna be like slamming down every one of their ideas, you know?
Now, Sarah's asked us a question. She wants to know, can you talk about what it's like working with the same director for such drastically or very different projects or subject matter, like you did with Marielle Heller?
Yes. Well, so I've been very lucky to work with several people a bunch of times. I got to work with Greg Mottola on like 3 different projects that were very different. And I got to work with Marielle on 3 projects and Kenny Lonergan on 2. And then like with TV shows, when you come back, you know, you get to go back and you get to work with a director again. It's really fun. It's so much easier the second time around because you've created a trust and an ease, and you already know that person. It's like, it's always kind of difficult in the beginning when you're working with a new director, like, oh, how are they going to feel about this? And are we going to mesh, you know, because sometimes you don't. Like sometimes your personalities just aren't, or you're just not the right fit. So, but in terms of it being a different type of project, it's interesting when it's a different type of project, because I like to jump around a lot and do a lot of different things. I've done some like big goofy comedies like Top 5 with Chris Rock, and that was really, really fun. And then I've done a movie like Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, or Can You Ever Forgive Me, or You Can Count on Me, which are much more like dramas and serious emotion. But I think it keeps you fresh, and like I don't want to just cut the same thing over and over again, you know.
Well,
And that's why TV too. That's why TV is good, because it's like fast. You know, you have to go through a lot.
How do you make sure that you, because that's one of the things I hear a lot of editors get frustrated with, is being pigeonholed. You know, oh, you cut dramas, you cut comedies, you cut this type of comedy. How did you approach your career so that you weren't pigeonholed?
Yes, I know it is a challenge. It's a big challenge. But early on, like I actually sort of started in documentary, and then I got an opportunity to cut a feature. My first feature was with Greg Mottola. So that was really fun. And that's sort of a comedy. It's a movie called The Daytrippers, and it's sort of a comedy with some dramatic moments. But I would say that I said I wanted to cut TV. When TV, it used to be that people would either cut TV or movies.
Yeah.
And early on, I was like, no, I want to do both. I want to cut TV too. So I made a big push with my agent to try to get me some TV work, because TV was starting to get really good.
Yeah.
You know? And then in terms of going between comedy and drama, is it like I did a lot of movies that were like I did You Can Count on Me, and it's a woman and her struggles and dealing with grief, and it's a great movie. I loved working on that movie, but I started to get a bit pigeonholed with like a lot of dramas about a woman, like a female lead and stuff like that. And I was like, I want to cut a comedy, you know, like I want to cut a comedy. And I was like, made a big push that I wanted to do, because I love cutting comedy. It's really fun. And so I was aggressive about find me a comedy, you know. Mm-hmm. And then it's also about getting in the interview. If you can get in the interview, if you can wow them in the interview, then they will hire you, you know. Any
tricks you have for people watching to wow them in the interview?
Well, it's good if you're cutting a comedy, if you make them laugh, you know, if you can think of something funny. I mean, it feels pretty good to make Chris Rock laugh, you know.
I was going to say, that was like Chris Rock, you have Will Ferrell on Succession. I mean, that would stress me out.
I didn't actually meet Will Ferrell, but that would have been incredible. But yes, for sure. No, absolutely. And listen, I go into interviews sometimes and I totally blow it.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes you just like, you're nervous, you say the wrong thing. But once in a while, it's like I just try to think about like, what do they want to hear? You know, honestly, I didn't go to Chris Rock and make a lot of jokes, because he's like a serious guy in terms of like the work that he does.
Yeah.
But
did you actually make him laugh, or?
I've definitely made him laugh.
Oh yeah.
Yes, I did. Yeah, and that's really fun. But I didn't go in with like, oh, I'm really hilarious.
Here's my stand-up.
Here's my bunch of
my 5
dumb
minutes
jokes. Yeah, exactly. He doesn't want that, you know. But like, you know, you sort of want to read the person, and I often do a lot of research about the person before I go into an interview. I try to like, recently I had an interview. Person had written a bunch of books, so I went into the interview, and we started to talk about the script. And I said, "Oh yeah, but I also kind of want to talk about these books you wrote." And he goes, "Oh, you mean you read that short little book?" And I was like, No, I read the 600-page book. I just finished it this morning. I wasn't lying, and I wasn't showing off.
Yeah.
I thought it was actually really fascinating. And we ended up talking about his book, and he really liked that. And it was one of the reasons we got along. So it's like, do some research and watch. Is another obvious one. Watch the movies they've done.
Yeah.
You know, you want to be able to talk about techniques they've done. And another thing I do is I read the script very carefully. So when we're talking about the script, I really know it, and I know the characters' names, and I have some good questions to talk about. And I'll always use a name of a character when I'm asking a question. You know, does Cynthia feel that blah, blah, blah? Because you're already kind of like in the world of talking about the story, and you're part of the story. You're not like, oh, the mom does this. You know, like you want to be like, you're really knowledgeable about this.
Now we have a question again from Harry. He wants to know, do you find it helps editing when you're working with a director who also wrote the script?
It's a challenge. Like sometimes it's great. Of course, if they're like an incredible writer, you know, like Kenneth Lonergan is an incredible writer. So of course that's great. But sometimes when they've written the script, they're like less interested in removing any of it or changing it, you know, so much. You know, when they're an incredible writer, it's wonderful. But it's the same with, like, if they're in it, it just makes it more challenging, because in some ways they're very close to it. Like maybe they've been writing the script for 6 years, you know, and they don't want to lose some line. And if they're a great writer, then that doesn't matter so much. But if they're not a great writer, or it's like there's parts of it that should go story-wise, then it's sort of a bummer that they're very attached to some little part. And then when they're in it, often it's a challenge because they're very like focused on their performance or how they look, or, you know, takes a lot of work.
Now I have one last question that I'd like to ask everyone I interview. And that is, what would you say your favorite guilty pleasure film or television show is to watch?
Oh, guilty pleasure. So many. I'll watch anything. You know, what's the one about the dads with you know, what's his name, Marky Mark in?
Oh yeah. Are you talking about a show or a movie?
The movie, you know, the one where he comes with all the dads and.
Oh.
You know, yeah, he's like the.
Daddy Daycare? No.
No, not Daddy Daycare. It's, oh God, I'm blanking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a really dumb, like big Will Ferrell comedies. I love big Will Ferrell comedy. I mean, any of those. Anchorman.
Daddy's Home.
Daddy's Home. That's it. Yeah. Daddy's Home. Like, it's a really, really stupid movie, but it makes me laugh like crazy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And have a great weekend.
You too, and good luck, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.